March 1945. The war in Europe is ending. Berlin burns. The Third Reich collapses under the weight of two advancing armies. In less than 2 months, Adolf Hitler will be dead. In less than 3, Germany will surrender unconditionally. But in the camps whose names most Americans have never heard, the machinery of death is working overtime. Dwight D. Eisenhower knows this. He has known for years. Detailed intelligence reports cross his desk regularly. Reconnaissance photographs, survivor testimonies, intercepted communications. The evidence is overwhelming, specific, and horrifying. Yet when American journalists ask about the rumors, the responses remain carefully vague. When questions arise in Washington about what's really happening behind German lines, the answers are measured, diplomatic, almost bureaucratic. This is not a story about what one man didn't know. It's about what he knew perfectly well and chose not to say. The question isn't whether the silence was justified. The question is whether it was necessary, and whether, in the end, it cost more lives than it saved. By March 1945, the intelligence is not fragmentary. It is comprehensive. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park have been decrypting German police communications since 1941. These intercepts, later known as the Holocaust by Bullets messages, document mass shootings in excruciating detail. Unit by unit, town by town, body count by body count, American intelligence officers have debriefed escaped prisoners. They've analyzed aerial photographs of Auschwitz taken during bombing runs to nearby industrial targets. The gas chambers are visible. The crematoria are visible. The railway lines leading directly to the complex are visible. In 1944, 2 Slovak Jews named Rudolf Verba and Alfred Wetzler escaped from Auschwitz and produced a 30-page report detailing the camp's layout, its gas chambers, and its killing capacity. The report reached Allied intelligence within weeks. It was translated. It was distributed. It was filed. The War Refugee Board, established by Franklin Roosevelt in January 1944, under pressure from Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, has compiled extensive documentation. They know the names of camps. They know the methods of killing. They know the scale. Eisenhower himself has access to all of it. As Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, his intelligence apparatus is the most sophisticated in military history. He reads summary reports daily. His staff briefs him regularly on developments across occupied Europe. He knows that Auschwitz-Birkenau has murdered over 1 million people. He knows that Treblinka, Sobibor, and Belzec were purpose-built death factories. He knows that as the Red Army advances from the east, the SS is forcing hundreds of thousands of prisoners on death marches westward into Germany itself. He knows that in camps like Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, and Buchenwald, camps that will soon be in the path of American and British forces, tens of thousands are dying from starvation, disease, and systematic neglect even as Allied armies approach. This is not speculation. This is confirmed intelligence. Eisenhower knows, so why doesn't he tell the American people? There is a ghost haunting every Allied headquarters in 1945. Its name is 1918. During the First World War, Allied propaganda reached extraordinary heights of invention. The Germans, the public was told, were bayoneting Belgian babies. They were rendering human corpses into soap and lubricants. They were committing atrocities so monstrous that the civilized world had no choice but to crush them utterly. After the war, most of these stories were exposed as fabrications, exaggerations. Propaganda designed to maintain public support for an increasingly unpopular conflict. The revelation left a scar on public consciousness. When reports of Nazi atrocities began emerging in the early 1942s, editors were skeptical. Journalists were cautious. The public was cynical. Nobody wanted to be fooled again. This skepticism wasn't theoretical. In November 1944, just 4 months before Eisenhower's silence, in March 1945, a Gallup poll asked Americans whether they believed reports that Germans had murdered many people in concentration camps. 76% said yes. That sounds reassuring until you examine the follow-up question. Those who believed were asked to estimate how many had been killed. The median answer was less than 100,000. Some guessed fewer than 10,000. By November 1944, the true number was already in the millions. The American people believed the camps existed. They believed people were dying. but they fundamentally could not grasp the scale. Their imagination, shaped by the lies of the previous war, could not accommodate the truth of this one. Eisenhower understood this. His press officers understood this. The question facing them wasn't whether to reveal information. Much of it was already public, buried in newspaper back pages and official statements. The question was whether anyone would believe it and what would happen if they didn't. Military command is an exercise in prioritization. Every decision is a choice about what matters most. In March 1945, Eisenhower faces challenges that would break lesser men. He commands 4 million troops across a front stretching from the Netherlands to Switzerland. His armies are racing toward the Rhine, preparing for the final assault into Germany's industrial heartland. Logistics are nightmarish. Supply lines stretch back to ports in France and Belgium. Fuel, ammunition, and food must move forward constantly. The German army, though collapsing, is still fighting. Every bridge crossing is contested. Every city requires street-by-street combat. The political situation is equally complex. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery wants priority for a northern thrust toward Berlin. American General George Patton wants to race through southern Germany. The Soviets, advancing from the east, are competing for territory and post-war influence. Churchill is pressuring Eisenhower to reach Berlin before Stalin. Roosevelt, dying and exhausted, is trying to maintain the alliance while planning for a United Nations that will supposedly prevent future wars. Into this maelstrom of military and political crisis, intelligence about the camps arrives daily. The reports are consistent. The horror is undeniable. But what, exactly, is Eisenhower supposed to do with this information? He cannot stop the killing. The camps are behind German lines, some still hundreds of miles from advancing Allied forces. Any attempt to mount rescue operations would divert resources from the main offensive, potentially prolonging the war and killing more Allied soldiers. He cannot bomb the camps. The proposals to bomb Auschwitz in 1944 were rejected partly on his authority. The military logic was clear. Bombing accuracy is limited, many prisoners would die, and the resources heavy bombers and fighter escorts are needed elsewhere. He cannot make a dramatic public announcement demanding immediate action because there is no immediate action available. The only way to stop the killing is to win the war faster. So he makes a calculation. He decides that the best service he can provide to the millions still suffering in Nazi captivity is to maintain operational focus, to keep his armies moving forward, to end the war as quickly as possible. This means accepting that thousands more will die while he remains publicly silent about what he knows. It's a reasonable calculation, perhaps even the correct one, but it comes with a cost he cannot yet see. While Eisenhower commands in Europe, a different kind of battle rages in America. The War Refugee Board is fighting desperately to get information about the Holocaust into newspapers. Treasury Secretary Morgenthau, who pushed Roosevelt to create the board, understands that public pressure is the only force that might compel action. But the information isn't landing. Newspapers run stories about Nazi atrocities, but they're placed on page 7, page 12, buried between advertisements and shipping news. Editors make these decisions for commercial and editorial reasons. War news is overwhelming. The public is fatigued. Stories about distant camps lack the immediate drama of battle reports from France or Italy. There's another factor, rarely spoken but widely understood. Many newspaper publishers are uncomfortable with stories that focus specifically on Jewish victims. There's concern that emphasizing Jewish suffering will feed into anti-Semitic narratives about Jews exaggerating persecution or trying to manipulate America into serving Jewish interests. This is the twisted logic of prejudice operating even among those who oppose the Nazis. The fear of appearing to care too much about Jews leads to caring publicly too little. The result is a peculiar disconnect. Information is available, reports are published, but the American people remain fundamentally unaware of the scale and nature of what's happening. A survey of American newspapers in early 1945 shows occasional stories about Nazi brutality, prisoner camps, and mass deaths. What the stories almost never convey is systematic, industrial-scale genocide, the specific targeting of Jews for complete annihilation, the fact that while battles are being won and lost, an entire people is being erased. Eisenhower could change this. A single press conference, a direct statement from the Supreme Commander revealing what Allied intelligence knows about the camps. The location, the numbers, The methods? Such a statement would make front-page news nationwide. It would force the story into public consciousness. It might generate pressure for action, though. What action remains unclear. But Eisenhower doesn't hold this press conference. He doesn't make this statement. His attention remains fixed on the military campaign, on the bridgeheads across the Rhine, on the encirclement of the Ruhr, on the final destruction of German military power. The camps, for now, remain someone else's problem. The 12th of April, 1945. Ohrdruf. It's a small concentration camp, a sub-camp of Buchenwald, located in central Germany. The 4th Armored Division liberates it almost by accident during the rapid advance toward Leipzig. What they find is beyond anything in their training or experience. Bodies stacked like cordwood, emaciated survivors barely able to walk, evidence of torture, starvation, and systematic cruelty. The SS guards fled days earlier, but they left the evidence behind. Eisenhower receives the report and makes an immediate decision. He will see it himself. He arrives at Ohrdruf on April 12 with Generals Omar Bradley and George Patton. Bradley later describes Eisenhower's reaction: barely controlled rage. Patton, the hardened cavalry officer who has seen combat on 3 continents, vomits. Eisenhower walks through the camp methodically. He examines the gallows. He looks at the bodies. He speaks with survivors. He orders his photographer to document everything. Then he does something unprecedented. He orders every American unit in the area that is not in active combat to visit the camp. He wants his soldiers to see what they're fighting against. He wants them to understand why the war had to be fought. But more importantly, he sends an immediate cable to Washington and London. He requests that journalists be flown to Germany. He requests that members of Congress be flown to Germany. He wants editors, legislators, and opinion leaders to see the camps with their own eyes. He explains his reasoning in the cable. The evidence is so horrific that future generations might claim it was propaganda. Allied propaganda. Exaggeration designed to justify the war. He wants witnesses. He wants documentation. He wants proof that cannot be denied. Within days, delegations arrive. Journalists file dispatches. Photographers capture images that will define the war's legacy. Congress members tour the camps and return to Washington shaken and angry. The American public finally begins to understand. But the question lingers. Why now? Why not in March, when the intelligence was already comprehensive? Why not in 1944, when the Verba-Wetzler report reached Allied hands? Why not in 1943, when decoded messages were already documenting mass murder? What changed wasn't the evidence. What changed was the ability to show rather than tell, to make people witnesses rather than readers. Eisenhower understood something profound about human psychology. People don't believe reports. They believe their eyes. They believe their representatives. They believe photographs and eyewitness testimony from sources they trust. In March 1945, he had reports. In April, he had proof. The silence, from this perspective, was strategic. Revealing intelligence in March would have produced skepticism and debate. Revealing camps in April produced conviction and outrage. But this justification assumes something troubling, that the primary concern was managing public opinion rather than saving lives. While Eisenhower maintained his silence through March 1945, people died. Not in combat. Not in strategic bombing raids. Not in the calculated violence of military necessity. They died in camps. From starvation. From disease. From casual brutality. From the grinding machinery of a system designed to reduce human beings to ash. The exact numbers are unknowable. Records were destroyed. Witnesses were murdered. But historians estimate that tens of thousands died in camps that would be liberated within weeks. At Bergen-Belsen, liberated by British forces on April 15, soldiers found 13,000 corpses lying unburied. Another 23,000 survivors were so far gone that they died in the following weeks despite medical care. At Buchenwald, liberated by Americans on April 11, prisoners had been receiving minimal rations for months. The SS had been conducting mass executions right up until the guards fled. Bodies were everywhere. At Dachau, liberated on April 29, American soldiers discovered railway cars filled with corpses. Prisoners evacuated from camps further east, left to die during transport. Could Eisenhower's silence in March have contributed to these deaths? The answer is complex and uncomfortable. A major public revelation in March would not have freed the camps faster. The pace of military advance was determined by logistics, German resistance, and strategic priorities. No press conference would have changed that, but a public revelation might have done something else. It might have created pressure to prioritize camp liberation over other military objectives, to divert resources toward reaching camps more quickly, to bomb railway lines used for prisoner transports, to demand that the German military surrender camps to neutral parties. These actions would have had costs. Diverted resources might have prolonged the war elsewhere. Changed priorities might have led to more Allied casualties. There are no simple counterfactuals. What's certain is that the silence had a moral cost. Thousands died while Allied commanders possessed information that might have generated pressure for action. The calculation to prioritize military efficiency over public transparency was rational, but it was also a choice to accept ongoing atrocities as the price of operational focus. Eisenhower made that choice. It's worth asking whether it was the right one. After the war, Eisenhower's defenders argued that his actions in April 1945 demonstrated his moral clarity. By immediately publicizing the camps once they were liberated, by ordering comprehensive documentation, by demanding that witnesses see the evidence, he ensured that the Holocaust would not be forgotten or denied. This is true. Eisenhower's actions in April were exemplary. The photographs, films, and testimonies gathered at his insistence became crucial evidence at Nuremberg. They educated a generation. They made denial impossible. But this defense sidesteps the question of March, of February, of 1944, and 1943. The military logic for silence was sound. Eisenhower's first responsibility was winning the war. Every decision had to be evaluated through that lens. Revealing intelligence might have compromised sources. It might have complicated diplomacy. It might have created pressure for actions that were militarily impractical. These are legitimate concerns. Command in wartime requires ruthless prioritization. Emotional responses must be subordinated to strategic necessity. But there's another perspective. The Holocaust wasn't incidental to the war. It wasn't a side effect of Nazi aggression. It was central to Nazi ideology and practice. It was, in a very real sense, what the war was about. By treating the camps primarily as an intelligence problem rather than a moral emergency, Allied leadership made a statement about priorities. Military victory mattered. Saving lives mattered. But stopping genocide while the genocide was still ongoing mattered less than operational efficiency. This wasn't unique to Eisenhower. Churchill made similar calculations. Roosevelt made similar calculations. Stalin, who knew about the camps from Soviet intelligence and liberated prisoners, barely mentioned the Jewish victims even after the war. The silence was institutional, strategic, defensible within the logic of military command. But defensible doesn't mean right. What would have happened if Eisenhower had spoken in March? Imagine a press conference. The Supreme Commander reveals that Allied intelligence has confirmed systematic genocide. He names camps. He provides numbers. He explains the method: industrial-scale murder using gas chambers and crematoria. He acknowledges that immediate rescue is impossible. The camps are behind enemy lines. But he calls for international pressure. He demands that neutral countries like Switzerland and Sweden take action. He appeals to the German people to resist SS control of the camps. He promises that camp personnel will face justice. The story dominates newspapers for days. The evidence is debated, questioned, and ultimately accepted. Public opinion hardens. Churches organize prayers. Activists demand action. Diplomatically, the situation becomes complicated. Soviet propagandists point out that they've been reporting Nazi atrocities for years, while Western allies expressed skepticism. Neutral countries resist pressure to act. The German government issues denials. But something else happens too. The pressure creates options. Sweden agrees to negotiate prisoner releases. The International Red Cross demands camp access. Some Wehrmacht officers, recognizing that the war is lost, begin quietly facilitating camp surrenders to avoid being associated with SS atrocities. Perhaps a few thousand more survive. Perhaps trains carrying prisoners are redirected. Perhaps some camps are surrendered earlier.